Welcome to the video from Ms. Rickert on appositives. If you can follow along with the packet that I have already given you, you will see the examples and you may learn a little extra information if you look at that packet as well. Now, I know you've seen appositives in the past. I know you've studied them. You studied them with Mr. Becker last year, and so you're probably thinking to yourself, why are we looking at this again? But these are the appositives you've seen. Ms. Rickert, comma, my English teacher, comma, trips, even when she stands still. Boring. I know you know how to do these. You've looked at these in the past so that you can punctuate sentences correctly, but this is not a senior level sentence. We're going to be learning more complex appositives. So let's just go back over appositives so that we can make sure everybody understands what they are. Appositives do give us more information about the noun we're talking about, but I like to think about them as replacement nouns. So for example, John, comma, my brother, comma, is an architect. Now, I don't need both of those things. My brother could replace John completely, and the sentence would read, my brother is an architect. My brother is a replacement noun for John. Now, when I talk about replacement nouns, what I don't mean is that we're actually taking out the first noun, but I do mean that we could, that they mean the same thing, but that my brother gives a slightly different take on the first noun. So obviously, appositives are nouns, always. So oftentimes you're going to see that they start with a or the, because those two words begin nouns. They can also start with the word one, for instance. Now oftentimes the appositives will have verbs and other words in them, so they're not necessarily just a noun, but the phrase itself must be a noun. Lastly, appositives must always go in a comma ghetto. They are always non-essential because they simply replace the first noun. You don't need them and you can drop them, so they go in a comma ghetto. Just to go back to they are nouns, because I forgot to mention this, appositives do not start with, of, to, any of those words. Those are prepositions and those are not noun words. They must start with a noun. To make matters more complicated, they can be quite long, and they can contain their own commas, and this may be the difference between what you're seeing now and what you've seen in the past. For example, a balding, comma, smooth-faced man, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Notice that the underlined appositive is more complex. It has its own comma. It's not simply one noun. But what's the noun? It's a man. Yes, the man has adjectives before him, but it's still a man. And what are we replacing? We're replacing he. We could just say a balding, smooth-faced man could have been. We don't need both of those things, but we're adding a little bit of information by using the appositive. Here's another one. It went away slowly, comma, the feeling of disappointment that came sharply after the thrill that made his shoulders ache. What are we replacing here? We're replacing it. What went away slowly? It's the feeling of a lot of things. It's a complex appositive at the end of the sentence to replace it. Now, a word of warning about appositives. They must be directly adjacent, that is next to, the nouns they replace. Let me give you an example of why that's important. Here's a sentence without an appositive. Mr. Danko gave Miss Rickert a pencil. Now, we're going to add an appositive, but you're going to see what the problem is. Mr. Danko gave Miss Rickert a pencil, comma, the redheaded one. So right now, it sounds like the pencil is a redheaded pencil. But I think we all realize that that's not quite the case. But when you put it at the end of the sentence, right next to pencil, that tells me that you're describing pencil, that you're replacing pencil. So we need to move it to the middle of the sentence. Mr. Danko gave Miss Rickert, comma, the redheaded one, comma, a pencil. That works much better. Obviously, it's Miss Rickert who's the redheaded one teacher. So we need to put the appositive directly next to the thing that it's replacing. But as long as they're adjacent to the noun they replace, they can go anywhere in the sentence. So they can open the sentence. One of 11 brothers and sisters, comma, Harriet was a moody, willful child. Notice that we're replacing Harriet. We put it right next to Harriet. And we're also using one. One is a noun. You can have a subject-verb split. A man, a weary old pensioner with a bald, dirty head and a stained brown corduroy waistcoat, comma, appeared at the door of a small gate lodge. We're replacing man, and we just thought it would be nice to put it right next to the man instead of right next to the lodge, because the lodge is not a weary old pensioner, the man is. You can also have appositives that close a sentence. The boy looked at them, comma, big, black, ugly insects. We're replacing them. And actually, I really like this appositive because otherwise we might not know what them is or what they are. So in this sense, we get an appositive that explains that, and it gives the replacement, big, black, ugly insects. Hour after hour he stood there, silent, motionless, a shadow carved in ebony and moonlight. Now, what's interesting about this is that if I ask you, what are we replacing? You're likely to say motionless, but that obviously would not be correct. That is not a noun. We're replacing he. So why can we put it at the end of the sentence instead of by the word he? We can do that because there's no other noun in here that we would get confused about. Obviously, if we put it at the end of the sentence, we're still talking about who he is, and we're replacing it with another noun. Now, let's talk about why we are studying appositives. We are not studying appositives so that we can punctuate correctly. This is not about passing the ACT or getting a good score on the compass. We're not looking at appositives for that reason. We're also not doing this just so we can sound nerdy. I don't really care what you call grammar things as long as you can understand and use them. We're not doing it so that we can write better fiction or sentences about people. All of those examples were about fictional situations, stories, narratives, but that's not why we're going to be studying appositives. We are studying appositives so that we can compose more interesting and varied sentences in argumentation. That's a lot more difficult to do. We're going to be looking at writing appositives for abstract nouns, abstract concepts, rather than people. It's very easy to write a positive about a tall man or a fat man or a boring man, but that's not going to help us when we're actually writing argument papers. So, for example, in fiction, we would use an appositive like this. Papa, comma, a good, quiet man, comma, spent the last hours before our parting moving aimlessly about the yard, comma, keeping to himself and avoiding me. You can easily write that sentence. But in argumentation, if we start with a sentence like this, advertising has created a need for unnecessary products, now it's a little bit more difficult to write in a positive. Here's one example. An amoral industry that relies on ever-increasing demand, comma, advertising has created a need for unnecessary products. And yes, I'm making this movie during the school day. So we're replacing the word advertising with another noun. And it is still a noun, even though it says an amoral, that's an adjective, but it's an amoral industry. That's the noun, and that describes just another way of replacing what advertising is. But it also gives us some more information. It's a much more interesting and complex sentence. So one thing we're going to be doing is unscrambling. This will help us to kind of get a sense of how appositives work. My rule for this is that you must write out the complete sentence every time. Trust me, you will not learn how to do these sentences if you just write B, C, D, A. It won't help you because your brain won't process what that means in terms of how sentences go. You must write out the sentence with correct punctuation, and that way you'll start to get a feel of how these work. So what we're going to do is look at these 4 sentence parts and put them in the order that they go in, and then also put the punctuation where it needs to go. So I just did this one for you on this next slide. She struggled as usual to maintain her calm, composed, friendly bearing, comma, a sort of mask she wore all over her body. Now, what are we replacing here? What's the sort of mask? It's not she. She's not a sort of mask. Her bearing is. Her bearing, and some of you probably don't know that that is a noun, her bearing is the way in which she holds herself. And her bearing is a sort of mask. So a sort of mask is just a replacement noun for what her bearing is. You're going to be taking a quiz in a couple of seconds on Edmodo. There aren't a lot of questions, and I hope you do really well. Please use your notes if you need to, and I will see you in class. Goodbye.